December 21st, 2017. Afternoon traffic rolled steady down Florida's Suncoast Parkway. A white pickup waited at a red light, brake lights glowing in the heat. Two motorcycles pulled up beside it, engines low, moving like ghosts. The lead rider tapped the window once and fired 6 shots. The driver slumped forward, foot still on the brake. His name was Paul Anderson, Florida president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. The shooter, Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano, was a small-time mechanic chasing respect he could never earn. That single act would shake every biker crew in Florida and start a war that should never have begun. Before the first bullet ever left that gun, the ground in Florida was already shaking beneath the boots of outlaw bikers. The Outlaws had ruled this state for decades, and they didn't share space with anyone who didn't kiss the ring first. Down in Tampa, St. Pete, and Miami, everybody knew the black and white skull patch wasn't just a logo, it was a warning. It meant control, fear, and history, stretching all the way back to the 1930s, when the club first fired up in McCook, Illinois. By the mid-80s, the Outlaws had turned Florida into their stronghold, pushing out rivals, burning down clubhouses, and reminding every smaller crew that the Sunshine State belonged to them. They called themselves the 1%, the outlaw elite who didn't follow society's rules. Their motto, "God forgives, outlaws don't," was painted across walls and jackets like scripture. It wasn't just words either. When someone crossed them, bodies showed up in ditches, clubhouses caught fire, and nobody asked too many questions. Even the police walked careful around their territories because one wrong move could set off a chain reaction. Detectives from Hillsborough to Pinellas County had case files stacked high on the Outlaws, but getting witnesses to talk was like chasing smoke. In their world, silence was loyalty, and loyalty was everything. The Outlaws weren't just feared because of violence. They ran a system. From gun pipelines to meth routes and protection rackets, everything ran through them. Their members had connections in trucking, construction, and strip clubs. They threw charity runs for kids while keeping one hand on the trigger. It was a game of image and intimidation, and nobody played it better than Paul Anderson. Paul wasn't just another biker. He was a Marine veteran, built like a wall, sharp-minded, and respected even by his enemies. He had served in Afghanistan, came home, and climbed through the ranks of the Outlaws fast. In Florida, he carried that patch like it was armor. People said when Paul walked into a bar, the air got heavy. He didn't have to yell to get respect because his record already spoke for him. For the Outlaws, he was the perfect face of authority. Military discipline wrapped in outlaw pride, and that's the world Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano decided to challenge. The 69ers Motorcycle Club wasn't built for war. They came from New York, born in the 1960s, and for a long time they kept a low profile. Their patch was a wolf with its tongue out, and their motto was, "The strength of the wolf is the pack." Sounds tough until you realize their Florida chapter was barely a handful of guys playing dress-up in a state run by real wolves. By the time they planted their flag in Tampa, they had maybe 6 or 7 members. They called themselves the Hillsborough chapter, a spin on Hillsborough County, but the name carried more attitude than muscle. These weren't career criminals with long sheets of violence. Most of them were mechanics, handymen, and ex-servicemen trying to find belonging in a rough world. The biker image gave them something to hold on to. They weren't built for the outlaw life they wanted to imitate. They wore the vests, learned the slang, and posed in photos, but they didn't understand the kind of bloodlines they were poking. Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano came up in that small circle. He was a mechanic with a big mouth, the kind of guy who believed fear alone could build power. People said he liked to play boss, barking orders and talking about respect, like he invented the word. In his head, he wasn't just leading a small club. He thought he was rewriting history. The patch made him feel untouchable, like he could walk shoulder to shoulder with the same men who had survived decades of blood feuds. But inside those Florida highways, it didn't take long to see the difference between fantasy and reality. Kasamano was chasing a dream he didn't understand. The 69ers in Tampa wanted to be recognized as a true 1% club, the kind you see on Discovery Channel biker shows, all leather and loyalty. But in Florida, you don't just declare that. You have to earn it through connections, alliances, and sometimes blood. The Outlaws had an unspoken law. No new patches without permission. Anyone flying colors without clearance was seen as disrespecting the hierarchy, and disrespect got handled quick. By early 2017, word was spreading that the 69ers were riding around Tampa in full gear, rocking their wolf logo like they owned the city. To the Outlaws, that was more than reckless. It was disrespectful. In the outlaw world, that's all it takes for things to get ugly. Florida had always been a pressure cooker for biker politics. Every city was divided by invisible lines, each one claimed by a specific crew. You had handshake agreements, alliances built through years of deals, and old grudges that never died. The Outlaws didn't just own turf, they owned silence. If you wore a patch they didn't approve, you were already a target. Smaller clubs like the Pagan Support Crews, the Warlocks, and the Mongols affiliated sets all knew to play quiet. But the 69ers were loud from day one. The Outlaws saw it as arrogance. They called them the mailmen because they were from up north delivering trouble nobody asked for. The 69ers called themselves soldiers, talking about unity and brotherhood. But to most of Florida's seasoned bikers, they were weekend warriors pretending to live the life. They'd hang out at bars bragging about being real one-percenters, while half the crowd rolled their eyes. Inside the Outlaws Tampa circle, word reached Paul Anderson about this new Killsborough chapter claiming space. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was seen as a challenge to their authority. And for a man like Anderson, who built his reputation on control and discipline, that challenge couldn't go unanswered. He knew the streets were watching. The first club to look weak would lose standing across the state. On the other side, Kasamano was hearing whispers that the Outlaws were watching him. Instead of cooling off, he doubled down. He wanted to show that his crew wasn't scared of anybody. Behind the garage doors in Tampa, the 69ers started calling meetings. They talked about making their mark, proving they could ride anywhere and not bow down. The problem was they didn't realize they were picking a fight with a club that had buried better men for less. Florida's biker scene at that time was like a map of tension ready to explode. Each patch represented a territory, and the Outlaws were the ones keeping everyone in line. Clubs that didn't follow the rules usually disappeared before anyone noticed. Police were already tracking motorcycle gangs across the state because the violence from the mid-80s and 90s had never truly died. But even law enforcement couldn't predict what was about to happen when pride met power. The Killsborough boys thought they were building a brotherhood. The Outlaws saw them as intruders. The line between both sides was thin, and every ride past each other on the highway felt heavier. It was only a matter of time before somebody crossed it. Down in those bars and back roads, people could already feel the temperature rising. Old bikers would warn newcomers to stay out of club politics. They'd say things like, "Don't flash what you can't defend." But pride has a way of silencing wisdom. For Kasamano, the respect he wanted came from confrontation, not patience. Every insult or stare felt personal. Every silence felt like disrespect. That's how wars start, not with money or power, but with pride. And Florida was about to learn what happens when a man with nothing to lose decides to fight men who already lost too much to quit. The streets were whispering, the Outlaws were watching, and the 69ers were about to make their first mistake. The kind of mistake that doesn't fade with time. The kind that writes your name in blood and police reports. And that's how the stage was set for a beatdown that would change everything. It was a warm Friday night in April 2017 when Palm Harbor came alive for the weekly bike night at the local brewing company. The smell of barbecue floated through the air. Engines rumbled in the parking lot, and every head turned when rows of bikes lined up under the streetlights. Shiny chrome, black leather, patches, and loud talk filled the night. You had weekend riders, veterans, and real deal club members sharing beers and stories. Nobody expected it to turn into one of the most talked about nights in Florida biker history. The Outlaws pulled up deep, their cuts clean, their presence heavy. When they rolled in, the crowd shifted like the air changed. The skull and piston logo on their backs caught the light, and everyone who knew the game understood what that patch meant. You didn't mess with it, you didn't challenge it, you didn't even stand too close without permission. Minutes later, the 69ers arrived, rocking their wolf head patches, smiling, thinking it was just another night to show face. The Outlaws stood by their bikes, watching quietly, while the newcomers acted like they didn't see them. Inside the crowd, whispers started floating around. People said, "That's Paul Anderson right there, the Florida president himself, dressed sharp, cool-faced, watching everything." He wasn't the type to talk much, but when he moved, everyone around him followed. Anderson spotted the 69ers laughing near the bar, their vests freshly pressed, their colors standing bright under the patio lights. He told one of his men, "Hold my beer," and walked straight toward them like he owned the place. The music faded a little as Anderson got closer. Conversations went quiet, just boots on pavement and engines idling. He looked right at the 69ers and asked, "Who runs this crew?" One of them pointed at Kasamano, trying to play confident. Anderson stared him down and said, "Either take those cuts off or die in them." The crowd froze. You could feel the tension like a wire about to snap. Anderson didn't blink, didn't move. Then the first punch landed and everything exploded. It happened fast, like somebody hit a switch. The Outlaws swung with brass knuckles and batons, knocking the 69ers into tables and beer coolers. Glass shattered, people screamed, and bikes fell over in the chaos. The 69ers tried fighting back, but they were outnumbered and outclassed. Blood hit the concrete, shirts ripped, and those fancy wolf patches started coming off one by one. Some tried running, but the outlaws chased them down, snatching their vests off like trophies. By the time police sirens echoed in the distance, the damage was already done. The outlaws left calm and proud, their boots clicking against the pavement as they carried the stolen vests like prizes from a hunt. In biker culture, losing your vest is worse than death. That cut isn't just a jacket, it's your identity, your loyalty, and your claim to the life you chose. Every stitch tells your story. When someone rips it off your back, it means you don't deserve the name you wear. That night, the 69ers lost more than fabric. They lost every ounce of respect they had tried to build. To the outlaws, it was justice. To the 69ers, it was humiliation that cut straight to the bone. When the fight ended, the Killsborough boys drove home bruised, bleeding, and quiet. Some stopped for beer on the way. Others went straight to their garages to drink alone. Kasamano didn't sleep that night. He sat in his garage, pacing the floor with a cigarette in his mouth, replaying the beating in his head. Every swing felt like a personal insult. He kept saying, "We're gonna handle this. We're gonna send 2 of them to the hospital and take back 2 vests." His crew sat around the table, nursing bruises and swollen faces, nodding as he spoke like they believed him. But deep down, most of them were scared. They knew the outlaws weren't regular street fighters. They ran deep and ruthless. Still, pride doesn't mix well with fear. That night inside the Killsborough garage, the plan for revenge started forming. The beer cans piled up, the anger built higher, and the idea of payback turned into obsession. Kasamano loved acting like a general. He wasn't educated, but he carried himself like a man born for command. His words were clumsy, but his attitude was loud. He talked about loyalty, honor, and respect like he invented the meaning. He told his crew they were soldiers now, that they were going to show everyone the 69ers weren't soft. To him, this was more than revenge. It was reputation. The Killsborough chapter wasn't built on discipline. It was a mix of personalities trying to play outlaw in a world run by real killers. Alan Big Beefy Guinto was the muscle, an ex-army guy with a short temper and heavy hands. He followed orders without thinking twice, the type to throw the first punch before asking questions. Michael Pumpkin Mencher was older, quiet, and cautious, a mechanic who stuck around because the club gave him purpose. He was the calm one, the guy who fixed bikes and tried to keep peace. Eric Big E. Robinson was a handyman, easygoing and loyal, but not built for chaos. Cody Little Savage Westling was the youngest, a firefighter prospect who wanted to prove himself. He looked up to Kasamano like a hero, even when the man was leading him straight into trouble. Then there was Sean Phelps Leonard, the vice president. He played it cool, always helpful, always listening. Nobody knew he was an informant for the ATF. He had microphones hidden in the clubhouse walls and a recorder in his vest. Every meeting, every argument, every whispered plan was getting picked up by federal ears. While the others talked about retaliation, Phelps was collecting evidence. Their so-called clubhouse was just a 2-car garage with beer, folding chairs, and a radio that never stopped playing classic rock. The smell of oil mixed with cigarette smoke and sweat. They hung flags, painted the walls with the slogans, and called it their base. Kasamano sat at the head of a wooden table, pretending to hold church meetings like the real 1%ers. The irony was thick because while he was playing outlaw, the feds were recording everything from 10 feet away. They called their area Killsborough, a nickname they thought sounded menacing. They spray painted it on walls, tagged it on social media, and used it in their biker posts. But that name would later turn against them, becoming a joke after the headlines broke. For now, though, it was pride. To them, Killsborough was home turf, the one place they thought nobody could touch them. Every time the Outlaws rode through Tampa, the 69ers felt the sting of that night all over again. People in the local biker bars whispered about the fight, laughing at how the Killsborough crew got stripped like rookies. That humiliation kept replaying like a broken record in Kasamano's head. It wasn't just the bruises, it was the loss of respect. Over the next few weeks, the garage became a war room. Kasamano kept talking about payback, pushing his men to get ready for something big. They cleaned their guns, tuned their bikes, and talked about sending messages. But the Outlaws weren't just sitting back either. Their scouts were everywhere, eyes watching every bar and parking lot for the next move. That night at Bike Night changed everything. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something darker. The Outlaws made a statement in public, showing every smaller club what happens when you cross the line. The 69ers couldn't forget it, and the Killsborough boys couldn't let it slide. Pride was the gas, revenge was the match, and Florida was about to burn. By summer, the streets were buzzing again, the same names floating around every biker bar and Facebook group. The Outlaws were still standing tall, and the Killsborough crew was plotting in silence. Everyone in the scene could feel that something ugly was coming, but nobody knew how far it would go. That night at Palm Harbor wasn't just a fight, it was a spark. A simple moment that turned embarrassment into fury. And for Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano, it was the start of his downfall. He just didn't know it yet. Inside that small garage in Tampa, the Killsborough crew started believing they were building something big. Every night, Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano gathered his boys around that wobbly wooden table with beer cans and cigar smoke floating through the air. He spoke like a man who thought he was preaching a gospel. He'd lean forward, point his finger, and talk about loyalty, power, and brotherhood. To his crew, he sounded like a mix between a preacher and a drunk uncle who talked too loud. Kasamano loved the feeling of control. He liked being the loudest voice in the room, shouting about respect and legacy while his guys nodded along. He called himself Prez, like it was a royal title, even though the chapter barely had 6 active riders. He used to say, "We ride deep, boys," knowing damn well they could barely fill a single lane on the highway. To outsiders, they looked like a small crew trying to look dangerous. But inside that garage, he had them convinced they were changing the Florida biker game. He told them they were writing history. He said they'd go down as the chapter that stood up to the outlaws and never backed down. The more he drank, the louder the stories got. He started claiming they were going to take Tampa back from the fake 1%ers. His voice carried that kind of anger that comes from pride, not purpose. Every night ended with toasts and chants about earning respect and making them pay. What his crew didn't know was that someone else had their ear in the room too. Their national boss, Arthur Serrano, who was running the 69ers overall, had heard about the beating in Palm Harbor. Serrano had been leading the club out of New York and wanted the Florida chapter to stand tall. He told Kasamano directly that if they didn't strike back, the 69ers would be seen as weak across the country. That pressure hit hard because for Kasamano, weakness was worse than failure. Serrano's call wasn't just advice. It was an order dressed up as motivation. After that, Kasamano changed. He stopped joking during meetings. He started talking about war. He told his boys, "We got a reputation to fix, and we ain't waiting on nobody to hand it back." He started using words like tactical and mission, trying to sound organized, but the truth was they didn't have a real plan. They were drinking, talking, and convincing themselves that revenge was strategy. Sean Phelps Leonard sat near the back during most meetings, nodding and pretending to be the calm voice in the group. Everyone trusted him because he spoke less and listened more. But the whole time, his vest carried a recording device. The ATF had flipped him months earlier, and they had him wired from every angle. Every joke, every plan, every whispered threat was being sent straight to a federal listening post in real time. Inside those church meetings, as the 69ers called them, the talk got reckless. Beer bottles covered the table, pistols sat next to ashtrays, and egos bounced off the walls. Kasamano would throw his hands up and shout, "We gonna make them remember our name." He'd pass around printed photos of outlaw members like he was planning a military hit, but the crew spent more time arguing about who'd ride shotgun than making any solid plan. It was bravado, not battle. From the recordings, agents later said it sounded like a bunch of guys pretending to be gangsters. They'd brag about taking heads and dropping bodies, but every time someone mentioned logistics, the room got quiet. Phelps, staying in character, played along. He'd ask questions like, "So we moving at night or day?" just to keep the conversation flowing for the tapes. On the other end, ATF agents would listen to the madness, shaking their heads at how loud the stupidity sounded. By July, the talk had turned into action. The Killsborough crew finally decided to make their first move. They heard that an outlaw captain named James "Jimbo" Costa was moving through Pinellas County, and Kasamano saw that as an opportunity to send a message. Costa wasn't just any outlaw. He was one of Paul Anderson's closest men, a known enforcer with a reputation for getting things handled. Taking him out would have sent a loud message. On July the 25th, 2017, Costa was driving near the Sunshine Skyway when a dark van started tailing him. Inside were members of the 69ers, Kasamano, Allen, Big Beefy Guinto, and a few others. They followed him through traffic, keeping their distance. When Costa slowed at the light, the van pulled up alongside him and bullets started flying. Witnesses later said it sounded like fireworks going off in the middle of the road. Costa's window shattered, but the man ducked, hit the gas, and swerved into an exit lane before the shooters could finish the job. He was bleeding, but alive. News spread quick. The outlaws knew exactly who was behind it. There weren't many people bold enough to try something like that in their territory. Within hours, every outlaw clubhouse in Florida was on alert. The word was lock in, load up, and ride smart. The police started investigating, but the outlaws didn't wait on them. They started gathering intel the streetway, asking questions at bars, and sending scouts around Tampa to track the 69ers' moves. Inside the Killsborough garage, the atmosphere was the opposite. They were celebrating like they had pulled off a hit from a movie. Kasamano bragged openly, saying, "I shot him myself." Guinto would later testify in court that Kasamano couldn't stop talking about it. He kept repeating that he had finally evened the score, even though Costa had survived. That arrogance would cost him everything later. The failed hit didn't just expose them to danger, it put the entire 69ers club under pressure. Arthur Serrano up in New York started hearing rumors that the Florida boys had made too much noise. The outlaws were angry, and law enforcement was circling in. But Serrano couldn't back them publicly without risking his own skin, so he told them to stay quiet and let things cool off. Kasamano didn't listen. He told his crew they were in too deep to turn back now. A few weeks later, in August 2017, something else lit the fuse again. Late one night, flames tore through the Outlaws clubhouse in St. Petersburg. By morning, the building was nothing but black walls and melted chrome. Firefighters showed up, but it was too late. The place was gone. Rumors hit the streets before the smoke even cleared. People said it was the 69ers getting their revenge, returning the embarrassment from bike night with fire. Nobody claimed responsibility, but the whispers pointed one way. For the Outlaws, that was enough. They didn't care about evidence or rumors. They treated it as war. The word in the biker bars was that the Outlaws had promised blood. They wanted payback, and they weren't waiting for police reports. The Killsborough crew felt the pressure closing in. Every time they rode out, cars tailed them. Every bar they walked into, heads turned. They could feel the Outlaws' eyes everywhere. Kasamano's nerves started cracking. He stopped sleeping much, kept his gun close, and told everyone they needed to make a statement. He said one big move would shut everybody up for good. That was the point when pride completely replaced sense. Instead of calming down, Kasamano decided he needed a body on the ground to prove his point. He started talking about going after high-ranking outlaws, saying that fear was the only language they'd understand. His crew followed along, still half drunk on ego and loyalty. The garage meetings turned darker. Guns were cleaned, ammo laid out, and the ATF microphones kept recording every word. In the streets, old-school bikers started saying the 69ers were cursed. Every time they moved, something bad followed. The club that started out chasing respect had turned into a crew of men trapped in a fantasy, guided by a man who couldn't see past his pride. The fire at St. Pete wasn't just another headline. It was the spark that pushed everyone toward a point they couldn't come back from. Inside that garage, Kasamano smiled like he still believed he had control. He looked around at his crew, lifted his beer, and said, "We about to make history." But what he didn't realize was that the feds were already watching. The outlaws were already waiting, and every word coming out of his mouth was digging his own grave. Florida was quiet for the moment, but it was the kind of quiet that comes right before the storm. And that storm was already forming, riding fast toward the man who thought he was ready for war. By the end of December 2017, tension in Tampa had reached a breaking point. The Killsborough crew wasn't moving like a club anymore. They were moving like a pack of men with nothing left to lose. The failed hit on Jimbo Costa and the St. Pete clubhouse fire had turned their name toxic in the streets. Every bar, every meetup, every biker event whispered the same thing. The 69ers were marked. Inside Kasamano's garage, the air was heavy with smoke, oil, and desperation. The crew gathered around the same battered table, their faces tight with frustration. It was a few days before Christmas, and most people in Tampa were focused on holiday lights and family dinners. But in that small garage, the conversation was all about blood. Kasamano stood near the tool rack, pacing back and forth, holding a beer that had gone warm. His voice carried the tone of a man who believed his next move would fix everything. He looked around and said, "I know where an outlaw is right now, let's handle it." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. They all knew what handle it meant. He explained that Paul Anderson, the Florida president of the Outlaws, had been spotted near Tampa, driving his white Ford F1 150. It was the same man who humiliated them at bike night months earlier, the one who told them to take those cuts off or die in them. Kasamano wanted that debt paid. He told his boys this was the time to even the score, to take back their pride. Michael Pumpkin Mencher, Alan Big Beefy Guinto, and Eric Big E. Robinson exchanged nervous looks. They all understood the weight of that target. Going after Anderson wasn't just a hit, it was suicide. The Outlaws didn't forgive, and killing their state president meant a war nobody could win. But pride had already poisoned their judgment. They planned it sloppy. 2 cars and 2 bikes, a formation that sounded military, but wasn't. Kasamano and Mencher would ride the bikes, both dressed in black, wearing gloves and no patches. Their license plates were flipped, just in case. Robinson and Guinto would drive the backup cars, one following close, one waiting for pickup. Nobody talked about escape routes or safe houses. It was pure chaos disguised as a mission. On the morning of December 21st, 2017, the crew met again before the ride. The Florida sun was bright, the air clear, and the city quiet. Kasamano gave one last speech, telling them that real men make moves, not excuses. He didn't sound like a leader anymore. He sounded like a man begging to feel powerful again. They nodded, strapped up, and rolled out. By the time they reached the Tampa limits, Anderson was already heading south on the Suncoast Parkway, driving toward his home in Pasco County. He had no idea he was being followed. Behind him, the 69ers moved in small formation, keeping distance but never losing sight. Toll cameras later showed 2 motorcycles and 2 cars entering the highway around the same time. The license plates on the bikes were bent upward, hiding the numbers. Kasamano led the way, Mencher riding close behind. Both wore black shirts, jeans, and gloves. No patches, no club colors, just 2 ghosts on bikes blending into afternoon traffic. They tailed Anderson for miles, waiting for the right moment. Every time they got close, another car would get between them. The highway noise and the rush of wind made communication impossible. Around 4 p.m., Anderson pulled off the Suncoast Parkway and headed toward the exit near State Road 54. Traffic slowed as cars hit the light. The sun reflected off the chrome, bouncing sharp across windshields. Witnesses would later say it looked like a normal moment, just another day on the road. But for the men in those helmets, it was the moment they'd been waiting for. Kasamano pulled up on the left side of the truck, Mencher on the right. Both bikes idled low, engines rumbling like growls. The red light froze everything in place. Kasamano reached out with his left hand and tapped the window once, the same way a man knocks before entering a door. Then came 6 quick shots. The first bullet shattered the window. The next 4 tore through the cab. The last one hit Anderson square in the jaw. He slumped over the steering wheel, his foot still pressing the brake. The truck rolled forward slowly, crossing the intersection, the horn blaring as his head leaned against it. Cars behind him froze. Drivers screamed. Some ducked for cover, others tried to reverse. The shooters didn't hesitate. They turned hard onto the next lane and gunned the engines, disappearing down the highway. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Witnesses later told police they saw 2 motorcycles speed off northbound, weaving through traffic like they knew every turn. Some thought it was a road rage incident. Others said it looked too clean to be random. One driver managed to catch part of a license plate on his dash cam, but the image was blurry. Within minutes, the Suncoast Parkway was a scene of chaos. Police cars, ambulances, and news vans flooded the area. By 5 p.m., the name Paul Anderson was already moving through the news wires. Reporters at ABC Action News and the Tampa Bay Times confirmed the worst. The Florida president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club had been gunned down in broad daylight. The headline flashed across every screen in the state: Outlaws president gunned down in traffic. Within hours, the biker world lit up like a signal fire. Outlaws across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama went silent online, locking down communication. Other clubs held emergency meetings. Everyone knew what this meant. You don't touch a president and live to ride again. Inside Tampa, the Killsborough crew didn't celebrate. They panicked. The realization hit hard that they had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Within hours, Kasamano called Sean Phelps Leonard, not knowing the man was wired for the ATF. The call was short but tense. Kasamano asked, "You got space in your garage?" He said it like a man asking for a place to hide. Mencher called right after, sounding nervous. He said, "It was too bright for that kind of work. We shouldn't have done it in the daytime." His voice shook, like he finally understood how deep they were in. On the other end, Phelps listened, his recorder catching every word, feeding the feds the first piece of real evidence. The ATF agents monitoring those calls knew exactly what they were hearing. They flagged the recordings, timestamped them, and began tracking the cell tower pings. Within hours, they knew who had been on the highway and in what direction they rode. Meanwhile, toll cameras from the Suncoast Parkway were being reviewed. The images weren't perfect, but they showed 2 motorcycles entering around 3:50 p.m. and exiting near County Line Road at 4:07. Both riders were wearing black shirts and dark helmets. One of the bikes had a dented gas tank and no visible plate. Investigators matched that detail to a bike registered to Michael Mencher. News coverage only made things worse. Detectives released a public appeal asking for information about 2 riders in dark clothing seen near the scene. The Outlaws didn't need confirmation. They already knew who was behind it. By midnight, the word in the biker world was clear. The 69ers had taken credit in whispers. but their names were already marked. The Outlaws clubhouses in St. Pete, Orlando, and Ocala went on lockdown. Members armed themselves and phones went dark. One source later said Anderson's death was treated like a declaration of war. Some of the outlaws wanted immediate retaliation. Others told their members to wait and let law enforcement handle it, knowing the feds would come hard after a public hit like that. Back in Tampa, the Killsborough garage was in chaos. Kasamano sat with Mencher and Guinto, trying to figure out what to do with the bikes. They wiped them down, switched the plates, and argued about whether to repaint them. Guinto later testified that Kasamano kept pacing, saying, "We did what we had to do. They got what was coming," but his voice cracked when he said it, like he was trying to convince himself. That same night, Phelps sent a message to his ATF handler confirming what everyone suspected. "They did it. They said Paul Anderson is gone." Those few words triggered one of the fastest homicide investigations in Florida biker history. The next morning, detectives from the Pasco County Sheriff's Office and the FBI joined the task force. They canvassed toll booths, pulled phone records, and matched surveillance footage from gas stations along the Parkway. Every breadcrumb pointed toward the Killsborough crew. By the weekend, law enforcement already had enough to move in. Cell tower data showed both Kasamano's and Mencher's phones pinging along the same stretch of highway at the same time as the shooting. Witness descriptions matched their builds and clothing. The pieces were falling together fast. For the Outlaws, Anderson's death turned the entire biker landscape upside down. People were scared to even mention his name in public. In their culture, losing a president in broad daylight was the ultimate insult. Within their circles, the story spread fast. Anderson was killed on his way home, unarmed, caught off guard at a stoplight. It was a message from pretenders trying to look powerful. By Sunday, social media pages flooded with tributes. Outlaws from across the country posted Anderson's photo with captions like "Ride in Power" and "Forever President." Memorial rides were organized within days, hundreds of bikers lining up on highways with black flags. In Tampa, people left candles near the site where the shooting happened, the asphalt still stained from the blood. Meanwhile, the Killsborough crew was unraveling. Phelps kept recording calls where they argued about what to do next. Mencher complained about being followed. Robinson said he saw cars parked near his house that didn't belong there. Guinto was drinking heavy, talking about leaving town. Kasamano still acted like he had it under control. He told them not to worry, that they beat the case if it ever came down to it. But every word he said was being fed to the ATF in real time. Every threat, every boast, every desperate plan was going straight into evidence. Within 48 hours, the feds had their suspects. The 69ers thought they had pulled off the ultimate revenge, but they had just handed the government everything it needed. By the time they realized it, it was too late. The hit on Paul Anderson didn't just kill a man, it killed an entire movement. The Outlaws lost a leader, but the 69ers lost their future. And Florida once again was about to become the stage for another bloody chapter in outlaw history. The morning after the shooting, the manhunt started like clockwork. Federal agents, local sheriffs, and highway patrol all linked up inside the command center in Pasco County. They laid out maps, call logs, and highway footage across long white tables. Everyone knew the suspects had to be local. The attack was too clean, too familiar, and too fast for outsiders. The name 69ers was already being whispered among investigators, and the ATF had more than whispers to work with. By noon, the toll booth footage started coming in. Cameras along the Suncoast Parkway showed two motorcycles entering near Tampa at 3:52 p.m. and exiting at 4:07. Both bikes matched the description given by witnesses. The license plates were flipped upward, but partial numbers appeared in two frames. That was all the agents needed. They ran every bike in Hillsborough County with matching bodywork and plate configurations. Within hours, the names Kasamano and Mencher came up. Next came the cell tower pings. The FBI analysts pulled data from towers lining the Parkway. At the time of the shooting, two phones connected to towers along the route, in perfect sync with the footage. The records placed them at every point where Anderson's truck was seen. There was no doubt left. The 69ers hadn't just been reckless. They had left digital fingerprints all over the crime scene. That night, surveillance teams parked near Eric Big E. Robinson's house in Tampa. The agents reported the sound of drills, grinders, and spray paint guns through the garage walls. They couldn't see inside, but they knew what that meant. The crew was trying to repaint and strip their bikes. One agent wrote in his report, "They're cleaning up their mess." Microphones hidden in Phelps' vest confirmed it. The same garage noises came through his wire, along with Kasamano's voice saying, "Make sure you hit the tank and the rims." Inside the ATF office, the evidence board was starting to look complete. They had toll footage, plate scans, cell data, and audio from the meetings. Phelps' recordings became the glue holding the case together. Every beer-fueled plan, every boast about sending a message, every phone call after the hit was recorded. The feds didn't need guesses anymore. They had proof. On December 22nd, less than 24 hours after the shooting, the first arrest began. The sun hadn't even risen when unmarked cars surrounded Kasamano's house in Tampa. SWAT moved in quick, flashlights cutting through the front door as agents yelled, "Federal warrant!" Kasamano came out half-dressed, confused, hands in the air. Inside his house, they found motorcycle gloves, spent shell casings, and a Glock 9mm under his bed. Michael Pumpkin Mincher was next. Agents found him at his shop, pretending to work on a car. He didn't resist, just looked down and said, "Guess I knew this day was coming." Alan Big Beefy Guinto was pulled from his apartment an hour later, still wearing his club ring. They were all driven to the same detention center in Pasco County, separated into different rooms, each one told that the others were already talking. Over the next few days, the rest of the crew fell like dominoes. Eric Robinson was picked up outside his house. Cody Little Savage Westling turned himself in after realizing the police were watching his job site, and by Christmas Eve, the whole Killsborough chapter was in custody. Inside the jail, the silence didn't last long. Word spread that the feds had someone on the inside. Every time one of them got called out for questioning, whispers followed. Someone was talking. Someone had to be. Phelps, still pretending to be loyal, called them from his safe house, saying things like, "Stay quiet, Prez. I got you." He told them to keep calm, to not panic. The calls were all recorded, each one feeding the agents new angles. Kasamano spent his time pacing his cell, bragging to anyone who'd listen that he'd beat the charges. He told the other inmates he was a one-percenter, a soldier in a war. But the story outside was different. Reporters were already calling it one of the biggest biker arrests in Florida history. His face was on the news, his name tied to murder, and the outlaws were staying silent. The first to break was Alan Big Beefy Guinto. After 2 days of questioning, he folded. He told investigators everything about the planning, the drive, and the shooting. He even repeated Kasamano's line, "I shot him myself." The prosecutors offered him a deal, 17 years in exchange for full testimony. He took it. The decision hit the crew like a grenade. When Guinto's cooperation leaked, the rest started panicking. Cody Little Savage Westling was next. He was young, scared, and facing life in prison. He told agents about the garage meetings, the repaints, and how Phelps always seemed too calm. Eric Big E. Robinson followed, his nerves breaking after being shown the audio tapes. He recognized his own voice on the recording, laughing about wiping down the bikes. The agents didn't need threats. The fear of the outlaws finding out who talked was worse than any sentence. Even higher up, the chain began to collapse. The 69ers regional boss, Arthur Serrano, who had pressured the Florida boys into retaliation, got caught in a separate drug case in New York. Facing decades in prison, he decided to cooperate too. He admitted that he told Kasamano to show strength after the bike night humiliation, but claimed he never ordered violence. He gave the feds the internal structure of the club, helping them map connections across several states. By February 2018, the 69ers looked more like a deck of cards scattered across federal hands. Every man was trying to save himself. Some asked for protective custody, others for reduced sentences. The brotherhood they had once toasted to in that smoky garage was gone. Kasamano stayed stubborn. Even as others flipped, he refused to admit guilt. He called himself Prez during interrogations, smirking at agents, saying, "You can't prove I pulled the trigger." But they didn't need him to confess. They had Guinto's statement, Mincher's fingerprints on a casing, and Phelps's recordings that captured his own words before and after the murder. Inside the jail, the talk shifted from loyalty to survival. The same men who once said ride or die were now asking their lawyers how to cut deals. One of the guards later said it was like watching a gang of brothers turn into strangers. They didn't sit together in the cafeteria anymore. They didn't share lawyers or commissary. Everyone knew who snitched and who didn't. Outside, the ATF called it one of the cleanest takedowns in Florida biker history. They had dismantled an entire chapter in less than 2 weeks. The recordings became the backbone of the prosecution. Every meeting, every conversation, every detail was timed and logged. The toll footage matched the cell data. The shell casings matched Kasamano's gun, and Guinto's story filled the gaps. By March, indictments were ready. The list was long: murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and firearms charges. Prosecutors stood in front of the cameras and said the Killsborough 69ers were responsible for the execution of Paul Anderson. The word execution hit hard because it made the act sound colder than any gang hit. Behind bars, Kasamano watched the press conferences on the jail TV. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen when they said his name. He tried to keep his expression calm, But the crew saw the cracks forming. He started drinking jail hooch, arguing with guards, and writing letters talking about betrayal. The brotherhood that had once been his pride was now his curse. Every man he called family was either silent or signing paperwork for the state. The outlaw dream that started in that garage with loud engines and fake confidence had ended under fluorescent lights and numbered jumpsuits. The ATF had played it perfectly. They didn't need gunfights or raids. They just let the 69ers destroy themselves from the inside. Pride started it, betrayal finished it, and by the time the dust settled, the Killsborough chapter was gone, leaving behind nothing but paperwork, ashes, and a name that would forever be tied to one of the most embarrassing downfalls in outlaw biker history. By the summer of 2019, the streets had gone quiet, but the Tampa Federal Courthouse was ready for war. It was July, humid and thick with tension, the kind of day where you could feel the heat rising off the concrete outside the glass doors. Inside, reporters filled the first 2 rows, their cameras flashing every time someone in a leather vest walked in. The rest of the gallery was packed with members of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. They didn't speak, didn't move much. They just sat in silence, their patches lined across the benches like a wall of ghosts, watching from the shadows. Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano entered the courtroom wearing a beige suit that didn't fit him right. His hair was slicked back, his face pale under the lights. He still carried the same smirk he used to wear in his garage, but it didn't land the same way here. Federal prosecutors didn't care about attitude. They cared about proof, and they had plenty. From the very start, the courtroom felt like a movie playing in slow motion. Prosecutors rolled out their evidence piece by piece, starting with the toll booth photos from December 21st, 2017. The screen showed 2 bikes, black helmets, flip plates, and a white pickup truck in front of them. Then came the cell tower data, lighting up the map like breadcrumbs. Every ping traced the same route Anderson drove that day. The jurors sat still, eyes fixed on the monitors. Then the tapes began to play. The sound of laughter, engines and bottles clinking, echoed through the speakers. It was Kasamano's voice, slurred but clear, bragging about war and making a statement. The jury heard him say things like, "We ain't backing down from nobody, and Florida's gonna remember our name." Every word dug the hole deeper. The prosecutors paused the recording, letting the silence sit heavy before moving on. The defense tried to object, but the judge overruled it. The tapes were too clean, too direct. They had timestamps, background chatter, and matching dates to every major event. The jurors even heard snippets of the conversation after the murder, where Kasamano called Phelps and said, "You got space in your garage?" The prosecutor repeated the line slowly, turning toward the jury, letting it sink in. In the corner, members of the Outlaws watched with cold expressions. They didn't speak to reporters or make noise, but everyone in that room knew why they were there. It wasn't just to see justice served. It was to make sure everyone remembered what happens when someone disrespects the patch. When it came time for witnesses, the government brought out their heavy hitters. The first was Sean Phelps Leonard, the man whose recordings built the case. He walked into the courtroom wearing plain clothes and a nervous look. His eyes stayed low, his voice steady, as he described how the club planned everything from that small garage in Tampa. He told the jury how Kasamano gave the orders, how the crew talked about sending a message, and how the bikes were prepped the night before. Every word hit like a hammer. Next came Alan Big Beefy Guinto. He took the stand with his hands shaking, voice breaking before he even started. The courtroom went silent as he looked across the room toward Kasamano. His eyes didn't hold anger, just regret. Through tears, he said, "He told me he did it for respect." That's what he kept saying. He wanted the Outlaws to remember his name. Some jurors looked away. Others just stared straight ahead. Cody Little Savage Westling followed. He repeated much of the same story, adding that after the shooting, Kasamano bragged about being the one who pulled the trigger. He said they celebrated in the garage until reality hit and everyone started panicking. His voice cracked when he described wiping blood off the bike. The prosecutor played another short clip of Kasamano talking about the murder, his laughter echoing across the courtroom. Then came Arthur Serrano, the 69ers national boss from New York. He wore a suit, his once proud biker image replaced by a man worn down by years of courtrooms and indictments. He explained the national politics of the 69ers, the rules about respect and retaliation, and why the Florida chapter felt pressure to strike back after the bike night humiliation. He admitted telling them to show strength, but said he never ordered violence. The prosecutor asked, "So when you told them to handle it, what did you expect?" Serrano hesitated and said quietly, "Not this." The defense tried to fight back, but the cracks showed fast. Mencher's lawyer blamed Kasamano, saying his client was just following orders. He argued that Mencher never fired a shot, that he was just there as backup. Kasamano's lawyer flipped it, saying Mencher was the shooter and his client didn't know the plan would turn deadly. Both men sat stiff at their tables, not looking at each other, not speaking. The so-called brotherhood had vanished, replaced by finger-pointing and silence. The defense painted the picture of chaos, saying it was never meant to be a murder, only intimidation. They called it a tragic mistake, but prosecutors countered with the recordings. In one clip, Mencher could be heard saying, "If he drove off, I would have just opened up into him." The courtroom went still after that line. The prosecutor let the words hang, then looked at the jury and said, "This wasn't a mistake, this was execution." Over the next few weeks, the courtroom turned into a stage for betrayal. Former friends stared at each other like strangers. The 69ers who once toasted beers together now argued through lawyers, their voices raised, their stories tangled. Prosecutors played clip after clip, matching every boast to every fact. The jury heard about the planning, the gun cleaning, and the calls made right after the murder. Every witness who flipped had their story lined up. It was airtight. Reporters outside wrote daily updates. Headlines read, "Wannabe outlaw faces life," and "Biker hit caught on tape." The story spread fast, not just across Florida, but across the entire biker scene nationwide. Even rival clubs called it embarrassing. The 69ers were mocked online as the club that destroyed itself. Inside the courtroom, the trial dragged on for weeks. The prosecution called for life sentences, saying the act was cold-blooded and deliberate. The defense tried to paint Kasamano as a misguided man chasing respect in a world that never accepted him. But the evidence was too strong. The recordings played his pride back in his own voice. After 5 weeks, the jury retired for deliberation. The outlaws stayed seated, quiet, their black vests lined across the gallery. The waiting stretched for 2 long weeks. Every day, reporters waited outside, speculating. Inside his cell, Kasamano told his lawyer he'd walk free. He still believed he was untouchable. On the 14th day, the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, holding the papers with steady hands. The clerk asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The answer came sharp and final. Guilty on all counts. Murder and conspiracy in aid of racketeering. The courtroom didn't erupt, it just went still. The outlaws in the back nodded slowly, their faces unreadable. For them, it wasn't celebration, it was closure. The man who tried to start a war was finished. When the judge read the sentence, the words echoed heavy. Life plus 30 years. Mencher got the same. The rest of the crew had already taken their deals, serving long years behind bars. The judge called it a tragedy born from arrogance. As the marshals led Kasamano away, he tried to smile, but it looked forced. His story had started with loud talk in a garage and ended in silence inside a courtroom. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as the outlaws walked past without a word. The war that never needed to happen was over, and the man who tried to play king had become just another cautionary tale in a world built on pride, betrayal, and bad decisions. The Florida biker scene would never forget the name Christopher "Dirty" Kasamano, but not for the reasons he wanted. When the courtroom lights faded and the news cycle moved on, Florida's biker world quietly reset. The outlaws went back to running their roots, their silence speaking louder than celebration. Nobody said Kasamano's name anymore. His story became a warning whispered in bars and clubhouses, a reminder of what happens when ego outruns sense. Inside prison walls, Kasamano still carried himself like a president. He bragged to new inmates about running Tampa, but everyone knew his name from the news. The 69ers cut all ties, shutting down the Killsborough chapter completely. The once loud clubhouse stood empty, walls tagged by vandals, the wolf logo fading under rain and dust. Paul Anderson's memorial rides continued every December, hundreds of bikers roaring through the Florida highways in his honor. His family stayed quiet, never giving interviews, letting the community speak for him. For investigators, the case became a textbook study on how pride can destroy an organization faster than any rival. The ATF used the recordings in training programs, teaching agents how patience and precision could dismantle entire gangs without a single bullet fired. Kasamano's empire ended where it began, in his own garage, surrounded by broken loyalty and lost respect. His story wasn't about power anymore. It was about a man who mistook attention for honor and dragged everyone around him into his downfall. In the outlaw world, names fade fast, legends live, fools vanish, and everyone else just rides on.